So we're going to have a quick discussion that's rather leaving a place for you to think about for the future, because we're moving in a certain direction. And in the certain direction we're moving in the sermons and in the thinking, I've had this thing about Exodus, like the book of Exodus and the first 5 books. Normally, whenever someone asks me what's the most important thing, what book can I read, what study can I do to know the Bible better, I tell them one thing: know the first 5 books of the Bible really well. Because if you know the first 5 books of the Bible really well, you'll know the whole background of everything that everything is built on. And sometimes we get bored, or we know the stories, but we're not chewing on the stories. So when you had these little Hebrew children and they were growing up, these stories were repeated to them constantly. And when they sat down, they didn't go to watch YouTube or TV. These stories were spoken of. That was what was constantly in the background. It's like, who grew up in a house with radio in the background, OFM, RSG, anything like that? Okay. So I grew up in a house like that, and I have the ability, they call it audiation. So when I am in the kitchen and I hear the radio's playing, then I go out of the kitchen, I walk through the whole house, and I come back, and in my mind, I'm in exactly the same space in the song as where it is on the radio now. Who's ever had that? Okay? So that means it's been running at the back of my mind all of the time. It's been occupying space while I was living life. Then you come back to the radio and, oh, we're still here, and you just continue. And that's something these Jewish children had. These Hebrew children growing up constantly had this thing occupying the back of their minds. And if you start to read more of the rabbinic literature, that's like the commentary, but for the Old Testament people who didn't have the Holy Spirit or Jesus, okay? So that's like a very Old Testament commentary. If you start to read that, you can see they chewed upon everything. They thought about it. Then they discussed it. Then they quarreled about it. Then they thought about it again. And I was going through the Old Testament, and I really like Genesis. So my 2026 promise is not to do so much Genesis. So I'm going on to the second book, Exodus, and the book just stumped me. It was just this amazing experience of rethinking everything. When is the first time in the Bible you read of a wilderness? The first time in the Bible you read of a wilderness. I'm still lying about my 2026 promise. I'm in Genesis now. Okay, so that's the second time. So you're really close. There's one time before that. Die aarde was woes en leeg. There was nothing. We call that wilderness. There is nothing. So we have this theme where there was nothing, and from this nothing, God created something. He created this place where man and God meets, and we are in control and responsible to look after everything, to have dominion. Okay? And Adam and Eve have their mishap, you know. They thought to themselves, we can be like God. We can, do you know, it's when you do business and you think you can cut out the middleman. They thought all knowledge and intellect they could have for themselves. And now they were put out of Eden into the wilderness. And now they're in the wilderness. But does God leave them alone in the wilderness? That's not how He works. Whenever He forces a wilderness in your life, He doesn't leave you alone. So that's a biblical theme. So He forces the Israelites out of Egypt, which kind of looked good if you think about it, because they constantly remind themselves, wasn't it better? At least we had meat and food and everything was nice there. Yes, they beat us, but that's okay. and now they're in the wilderness. You have Moses goes into a wilderness. You have David that goes into a wilderness. You have Abraham that goes into a wilderness. You have Jacob. Remember, just before he had that stairway to heaven moment, he was in the wilderness. You had this beautiful thing. You know that lady named Hagar. Do you know that they kicked her out into the wilderness, and as she was crying, who met her in the wilderness? God. And he said, they might have put you in the wilderness, but I'm going to protect you. And he's actually a God of the wilderness. And that's where we as a people miss it, because if we experience wilderness, we think, where's God? And he's like, don't worry, I'll encamp in the middle of you. I'll move with you. I'll be Emmanuel between you while you're in this wilderness. Because he's actually a God of the wilderness. Because what happens in the wilderness? You get prepared to inherit the promised land. Think about it. What would have happened if, okay, in your mind's eye, imagine Egypt. What do you think first thing, Egypt? What does it look like? It was the most fertile place in that time. Along that Nile and the deltas, even if, do yourself a favor, go on Google Maps, click in Egypt, and go zoom in, and you'll see farms. It's this tiny little stripes going this way and that way. They don't have spulpunter. This way and that way and this way and that way. Tiny little stripes going everywhere because it's green around that part. And do you know there was a sack, it's the correct word. Do you know there's this short space between Egypt and the promised land? It was called a highway. They had this highway in old times when the Egyptians were there and the Israelites, and it would be quickly to the promised land. You know, and do you know, if you look at Google Maps, what the promised land highway looks like, the color of the map? It's green. It's very fertile. It's not wilderness. It's nice way. And then you go to Exodus 13:17 in the ESV, the correct Bible, and you go there and you read, it says, and Pharaoh said, go away. I don't want you here anymore. And God said, let's go. But I'm not taking you on the route via the Philistines. Because when you see war, you'll turn around. You'll go back to Egypt. And that's the wilderness. It's a space where God thinks, you know, there's this Bible verse that says he won't challenge you above the ability you have to handle it. Welcome to Exodus 13, verse 17. The wilderness is the place where he trains your ability to handle it. And you know how many times they had the option to say, this isn't for us, I'd rather go back? Multiple times. So many times the earth opened up and those who were too difficult, it just ate them. Multiple times. And I think this is the short thing we need to ask ourselves. How often does this theme occur in our life, this wilderness theme, and we rather go back to Egypt? Do you know how comfortable we get in slavery? Just because it's fine, we allow things that are not fine to be done to us. That's called slavery. Because it's better than not knowing. Because if I knew, I would turn around. But now God says, don't worry about that. I'll lead you to the promised land. You know, wink, wink. They thinking highway to the promised land. He's thinking, I need to change a lot of things in these people. Because if Adam and Eve was kicked out of the garden into the wilderness, they stayed at the gate for a week and he said, no, don't worry, you can come back. What would have happened? Horrible things. Things they could not handle. they would have died. It would have been the worst ever thing for him to make it easy for them. And he said, you know, I can stay here in the garden or I can move with you. And he says, I'll just move with you. I'm not leaving you in the wilderness. And you have that exact same thing. If the Israelites had their decision, if they could make up their mind and say what they wanted to do, they would have gone back to Egypt. How would the story have turned out? Would we have the book of Joshua, Judges, Kings? No, there would be no kings because they would still be slaves. So I think in something we can think for ourselves and chew upon in this midbar, this wilderness concept, you should ask yourself, what places are currently enslaving me in my life? And am I sticking to because the wilderness is too scary? Transformation is too scary, so I'll rather stay here. But it stays true. Transform or die. You can be a slave or you can take a chance. And one of the main themes is as soon as God, He sometimes leaves you in the middle of nowhere. You get those three guys in the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and He's like nowhere. He didn't even give them a WhatsApp. They just said, well, we believe the following. And what happens when they're thrown into the fire? He appears. Because in the wilderness, you'll find God. Okay? So now let's connect this. Who wants to know God more? You won't find Him in slavery. You find Him in difficult spaces where you ask questions about everything. Where you lose a culture of things you think were the truth, and you pick up a culture that allows you to inherit the promise. So think about this wilderness theme, think about everything, and really ask yourself the question, slavery was Egypt, but they thought it was the garden. What do you think is the garden, but it's actually slavery? What's holding you back? I said to Paul when we were having a meeting, I said to him, I was watching an interview with Trevor Noah and someone else, and Trevor Noah was the host of the Tonight Today show or something, a really important American TV show, like really important. And he decided to no longer be the host of that. And that's like stupid. Why would you do that? He's like at the top of his entertainment world. There's nothing higher than being that host. And he said he was in South Africa visiting a friend, and that friend said to him, Trevor, if you do not starve yourself, you'll never know when they are starving you. If you don't know what slavery looks like, you'll never know that you are a slave. If you don't allow difficult things to happen in your life, you always stick to the easy things. You always think this is how it's supposed to be. We call that propaganda. When they say everything's fine but the world is burning, don't worry, everything's fine, the world's burning. But this is how it's supposed to be. That's a Genesis thing. Ruling and having dominion means ruling and having dominion over your mind and your situations as well. And slavery is not ruling, that's being ruled. So this is a question. Ask yourself, especially now with the fast, because this is an introduction into the fast. Where am I still a slave? And am I willing to go into the wilderness? And some things will die in the wilderness. That's okay. They needed to die. But some things will survive. And they will be able and fit. We had slaves. When they came into the promised land, we had warriors. It took a while. But it's possible. And they worked in the promised land. They did not just sit, they worked in the promised land. But you know what? It's far better growing your own grapes than growing someone else's. The promised land is worth it. Knowing God is worth it. But it's never free. It will cost you something. And I think with this fast, this is one of the most basic and most important things to constantly ask you. What am I a slave to? Am I willing to go through the wilderness to drop this?